Hello. Hello. Do you hear me? So, good evening, everybody. I hope you hear me now. I apologize for 5 minutes late. Tonight we'll be talking again about Serbian saints of recent time. It's 8th lecture in a row right now, and I now try to share my screen. Please let me know if you have any troubles with seeing this. I hope now you see the slides. So thank you for attending these lectures, and one more time, good evening, everybody. So tonight we'll be talking about even more recent saints, comparing to the other that we talked about previously. Tonight we come to a recent time, meaning a communist era in former Yugoslavia. So it's a mid of 20th century and second half of 20th century. As you know, communists came into power in Yugoslavia in 1945 at the end of the Second World War, after making an alliance and becoming allies with the allied forces of United States, UK, and France, and Soviet Union. So they just grabbed some favor from them at some point, and they just turned the curse of the war, which initially was started by the remaining forces of the Kingdom of Yugoslavia, which stayed in the country. But most of them were captured by Germans, and some of them stayed and organized by General Draža Mihailovic. But the other movement was communist movement in Yugoslavia, which took opportunity of this chaos state in the country and being the occupation, and so they started their own fight against Germans. At some point, they gradually became more favored than Chetnik movement of General Draža, and subsequently had the great conferences in Tehran, in Yalta, and later among the great forces of the war. They were chosen as more favorable, and it was some, let's say, more global policy how they got into power, and they were given the rulership and power in the Yugoslavia. So they changed the structure of the state of the country, from kingdom into the republic, and from liberal democracy to communism and so on. And these two saints, which I am going to present them tonight, have been living both in the Kingdom of Yugoslavia and subsequently in the communist Yugoslavia. One of them is Varnava, Bishop of Hvostna, Varnava Nastic, and the other one is Jakov Arsovic. He was a monk in the monastery of Tumane in eastern part of Serbia. In fact, he was not there. He was entombed. He passed away near that monastery, and his tomb place was there for years until his relics were found incorruptible and so. But he initially was living as a monk in Žiča monastery, which I will be talking about later. So, since I introduced here some new terms, I would like just to clarify them here right now based on their meaning. As I told previously, maybe you have seen it here, that Bishop Varnava was a bishop vicar or vicarius, which in Latin means adjunct bishop, or bishop who is not the diocesan bishop, who cannot govern a whole diocese, but can be as an adjunct bishop to help the diocesan bishop. And that was the case with Bishop Varnava, since he was a consecrated bishop in a young age of 33 years old. So he was assigned first as a vicar bishop and sent to help the missing diocesan government and missing bishops in in city of Sarajevo and the diocese of Sarajevo and Hvostna at the time after the war. Since, as you might know, during the Second World War, the western part of Kingdom of Yugoslavia became independent state of Croatia, and there was a persecution of Serbs, both of Serbian population, of laymen, and of clergymen, even more. So most of bishops on the dioceses which belonged to the formed independent state of Croatia were either murdered, most of them murdered, and some of them expelled from the territory of that state. And among those seats which were emptied or like just missing bishops, it was also city of Sarajevo, because Metropolitan Peter Zimonjić, which I presented, I talked about him several lectures ago. He was arrested in 1941 in May, and then subsequently tortured and murdered in the territory of Lika, Croatia. So his seat, bishopric seat or metropolitan seat of Sarajevo, was empty at the time, at the end of the war. And many other, like seat of Banja Luka, seat of Zagreb, many other. When I say seat, I mean bishopric seat. It's just symbol of the bishopric government or leading bishopric government in one area or one city. So Bishop Varnava was sent there to replace the emptied seat of Sarajevo. And this name, his name Varnava, or in English we can say Barnabas, or whatever it's correct pronouncing, which literally means the son of Nava or Nabas. It's from Jewish Hebrew language. And it's the way how most of people were named by their fathers or by their ancestors. And in the New Testament, one of the disciples of the apostles and one of those, let's say, minor apostles or 70 apostles, one of those 70, was Barnabas or Varnava, who served evangelist Luke and was his disciple as well, particularly worked with him closely and helped him in writing his gospel by Luke and work of apostles as well. And he's also mentioned several times in the books of the New Testament. So that's how that name was accepted by Christians, and later, subsequently, many Christians were baptized in that name. And later on, it's also adopted in the monastic orders. So many monks receive that name, which now can be a little bit archaic for like laymen, as you know, in Serbian language as well, but it's still used in the monastic orders. And I mentioned that Bishop Varnava was Bishop of Hvostna. It is a titular bishop, so titular diocese of Hvostna. In past, it was a full diocese, like regular diocese, but during the course of history, for some reasons, most of the population moved from there, partly to nowadays Hungary and northern Serbia, like Vojvodina. So that seat, bishopric seat, became just titular. That's what we can also say for vicar bishop or bishop vicar. We can say titular bishop as well. That's also correct term. And that's a titular diocese of Hvostna, no more as an active diocese, but just as a titular diocese. So most of those vicar bishops received those historic, now just titular diocese names. And here also, I would like to make some connection between the saints I presented recently. So now this kind of spiritual genealogy, I call it. As you can see here, some of these saints are somehow connected. For instance, we mentioned Bishop Nikolai at the beginning of this series. One of the first lectures was dedicated to him, because he's one of the greatest Serbian saints of all the time. But he also unified all the other saints in some way, especially particularly in 20th century. For instance, three of the saints which are presented previously or are being presented right now are his disciples at Saint Justin of Celje and two of tonight, Saint Jakov Arsovic and Saint Varnava of Hvostna. At the same time, Bishop Varnava was also a disciple of Saint Peter of Sarajevo, Metropolitan of Sarajevo, who also was a martyr, Hieromartyr, same way, similar way like Bishop Varnava, as we'll see tonight. There is some difference which I will point out here between Bishop Varnava and Metropolitan Peter. That's why I did not put Bishop Varnava in the lecture about martyrs for faith for some particular reason. And here you can see also that one of famous martyrs bishops, it's like Bishop Platon of Banja Luka. He was, during his life, at least in the last period of his life, several years before becoming a bishop and during his bishop serving, he was in a controversy with Bishop Nikolai, in kind of enmity. We can say technically they were enemies for over some disputes, and it prolonged and it lasted. It even moved into the newspapers and something like that. It made just a kind of problem in the church for some time, because Saint Platon was accused for some intolerant behavior to some parishioners and something like that. He was a bit like a specific temper, you know. And well, on the other side, Platon accused Bishop Nikolai for misconducting of the administrative work in his diocese. So there was some kind of controversy between the administration and the spirituality. But nevertheless, it did not cause any one of them not to be saint, because as I mentioned in past, and I will just remind you again, it's not just our deeds or something that we have as a good or as a bad is mandatory or compulsory for someone to become recognized as saint. So it's a matter of God's grace or God's blessing based on our lives and based on our heart, which we cannot know for the other people. So whenever we are about to judge somebody over some sin, some vice, some whatever, misbehavior or whatever, I apologize, we must keep in mind that only God knows what the repentance of someone is, what the secret deeds and secret faith or anything secret in his or her heart is. So this is the same with saints that I was representing and I'm still representing here. So Saint Platon gave his life for the faith. He did not want to leave the city, the country of independent state of Croatia. He didn't want to leave his flock, his parishioners, his diocesans, but he wanted to share their faith. Whatever happened to them will happen to him as well. So he was murdered as a first, as the example to the other people what will happen to them if they disobey the orders of independent state of Croatia. So he was, as in Christianity it's frequently say, for that kind of death, he was baptized in blood. In fact, everything that was in past of his life was somehow by that way also justified by his end, where he was giving his life for Christ. And on the other side, Bishop Nikolai gave whole his life and all his deeds and writings and work for his parishioners, for his faith people, and for the whole Serbian Orthodox people at all. And okay, so let's turn now in more detail about Saint Varnava, Bishop of Hvostna. This is also very, very interesting and important maybe here to mention that he was born in United States of America, in Gary, Indiana, where his parents came a few years before he was born. And his father originally was from Herzegovina, and in his youth he moved to Sarajevo. He became a merchant, a very successful one. But later he decided to move to one of his relatives who was already in the United States, and so he moved there just a few years prior to the First World War, and continued his merchant business there. As you know, at that time, in the beginning of the 20th century, Gary, Indiana was a big colony of Serbian immigrants in all the area around the big lakes there. Now it's more unfamously known as a Rusty Belt because of that economy dropped later. But at that time, it was raising the economy there. Many people came there, worked there. Some of them as miners, some of them as factory workers, some of them like merchants and salesmen. And some of them opened some stores, and so, you know. And what is characteristic also for his parents, that they were very pious, devoted to God, to church. They supported church, like financial sense, but also they were like attendants, like in regular basis to church services, both in US and prior to that in Bosnia and Herzegovina, and later also when they returned back, as you know. And Bishop Varnava's baptismal name was Vojislav Nastic. As I told, like Nastic family is from some part of Herzegovina, although some Nastic also, there are some Nastic in the other area Serbian lands. And he had two younger siblings, two younger brothers, which were also born during their staying in the United States. But as you know, the onset of First World War coincides with the year of the birth of Bishop Varnava in 1914, and that period is known as kind of romanticism in Serbian history, a romantic epoch or a romantic era, where Serbian people and Serbian state tried to be kind of Piedmont for Italy. What Piedmont was for Italy, a center of unification of the whole Kingdom of Italy at the time. It was same with the Kingdom of Serbia, which acted as a unification center to unify the whole southern Slavs, including all the Serbs on the Balkan Peninsula, but also Kingdom of Serbia wanted to include Croatians and Slovenians into that state. So at the end of the First World War in 1918, a newly state of Yugoslavia was created as a kingdom of Serbs, Croatians and Slovenes. Later it was renamed into Kingdom of Yugoslavia. So it was really, I say, romantic and enthusiastic period in our history, because it gave such a deep impression to many of our diaspora all over the world, particularly in North America. As you know from the past lectures, at some point, Bishop Nikolai, at that time still a priest, he was sent to United States and to UK as a kind of mission to attract young people to enlist as military volunteers to go to the front to the battles in the First World War, and also he initiated supporting activities from the United States and from our community in the United States. So at that time, many people were following what's going on there in their old lands. And at the end of the war, as the new country was formed, many of the immigrants decided to get back to their old lands. It was same with the parents of Bishop Varnava, at the time still Vojislav Nastic. So his parents decided to move back to the city of Sarajevo, and they returned in 1922 when Vojislav was only 8 years old. He graduated 2 grades in elementary school in the United States, then moved and continued his education in Sarajevo in Bosnia. He was really outstanding in many subjects in all over his education time. And besides that, he played violin. He was singing nicely. He was really good in solfeggio and musical skills. Besides that, he spoke several languages. But what was particularly characteristic for him, he was really pious and devoted to church and prayers. And he knew that he would like to become a priest, or anyway, to serve in church. So he wanted to study theology and even more to receive monastic vows. For that reason, during his childhood, he undertook several visits to Ohrid, where at the time Bishop Nikolai was residing and governing the diocese of Ohrid, later Ohrid and Bitola. So first time Vojislav came with his father, who was acquaintance of Bishop Nikolai. They came there for an advice. They wanted to ask Bishop Nikolai about the intention of his son to become a clergyman, moreover become a monk. So since Vojislav at the time was still a young boy in elementary school, his father just presented the case to Bishop Nikolai, asked him for advice. But Bishop Nikolai advised that it's better for young Vojislav to continue secular education like high school, not to go to theological seminary. But after graduation in high school, in gymnasium, I suppose you know that in Europe and also in Serbia, high schools are sometimes called gymnasium for for those high schools which offer comprehensive education, unlike the other particularly designed high schools for some skills or for some specific education in some particular area. So, Bishop Nikolai suggested young Vojislav to continue education and then to go to university for theological education. And also he promised that he will pray for him to be accepted by God as a monk. Because for monasticism, it's something special in particular that it must be also an act of God and supported by God's will, so that someone must feel a vocation for that, not just kind of desire or dreaming of something. You know, it must be, let's say, synergistic work, so that God invites somebody to become monk, and the person also has that will and inclination to that, so that there is kind of mutual deed and act by the God's will. At the same time, yes, here I think we can see only, maybe I can move this a little bit. Okay. At the same time, upon graduation in high school, Vojislav went to his diocesan bishop, Metropolitan Peter Zimonjić of Sarajevo, to ask for a blessing, because, as you know, to study theology, you must receive a blessing from a bishop, from any bishop. So, which means that theological education is not just a personal will or like personal, let's say, just kind of how to say, it's not just for I can say for fun or for something like that. It is always kind of devotion to church, so the church in general and the bishop as a representative of church decides over the candidates where and what they will do and serve, how they will serve in church. So church has kind of planning for all their candidates which are accepted for theological schools, subsequently to become servants for church, either as a priest, as clergyman, or even as a layman, as a professors in seminaries or academias or whatever. So it's a kind of project. It's not just a personal will and deliberately, you know. And so for being a resident of Sarajevo, Vojislav decided to go to the diocesan bishop of the very city of Sarajevo, which was Saint Peter at the time. That's how he became also disciple of this great saint, as his, let's say, cadet, or like spiritually connected as one of the students who were sent by him to the school. And he spent years there. He was educated at the University of Belgrade, theological school, graduated on time after 4 years in 1937, and immediately got a position as a teacher in high school, in 2 high schools in Sarajevo. One of those was a preparatory school for future elementary school teachers, and the other one was a grammar school in Sarajevo at the time. But not long time after that, he decided to become monk. He went to Miroslav monastery. One more time before that, he visited Bishop Nikolai. It was about 15 years after his first initial visit there, to inform him that he now graduated theology and that now the time is fulfilled for him to become a monk. And Bishop Nikolai then blessed him for that, as he was praying and kept him in mind, which means during the liturgies and elsewhere. So he suggested him to go to monastery of Mileševa. So Vojislav went to Mileševa, and there he received the monastic vows and was consecrated a monk by Metropolitan Peter, who was his diocesan bishop, and who was kind of spiritual father for him. So this is pretty straightforward story for many theologians who decide to become monk. As you can see, for Vojislav, so he received the name of Varnava. As Apostle Varnava was also very pious and very silent, quiet, but very devoted to reading and writing. It was the same case with Varnava, who started publishing his articles in theology in some theological journals as soon as being a student at the School of Theology in Belgrade. One of his articles was about repentance, and the other one was about pride in a negative sense, I mean, as a sin. So he expressed in a very sharp and very sophisticated form, very critical opinion of that, but with no judging over the people who are under the sins, but only over the sin as itself. It's very specific stance that he expressed in these articles, which present him as already formed, shaped theologian, as like holy fathers from the early centuries of Christian church. But not long after that, Second World War started. This was ongoing in Yugoslavia in 1941. As you know, it provoked many problems and controversies. At the same time, there was a formation of an independent state of Croatia, which proved to be a mass grave for many Serbian population there. Over 1 million of Serbs were murdered in that country, in that puppet state of Nazi Germany. At the same time, many of Jewish community also were persecuted and murdered, Serbs as well. At the same time, Muslim population who declared as Serbs of the Islamic faith, or like Serb Muslims at that time, not as an independent nation as it is now, like artificially proclaimed. So that population also came under the cover of Croatian state, and majority of that population of Muslims accepted Nazi Croatian rulership and government and served in the paramilitary forces of Handjar Brigade. It's a very unfamous over the atrocities and crimes they committed in the 1943-1944. So Varnava at the time, a priest serving in several churches in Sarajevo, in the lack of priests who were murdered or persecuted and so he stayed there, but he bravely expressed his faith. He did not hide himself or doing like that. He always stand firm, but always silent, not so like outspoken and so. But he preached in the church of Sarajevo. And somehow, by God's protection, he was not murdered. It's a very interesting point in his life. It's a very interesting point that whenever we are brave and putting our hope fully to God, we receive as God has plans with us. So, although Varnava was as brave as maybe many other priests who received martyrdom by Croatian Ustaša forces, Varnava survived somehow. He was not murdered, although not doing any kind of bad behavior or like preaching or like cover this, nothing like that. But at the same time, he was not murdered. So God had a plan with him for the future, what had happened later. So at the end of the war, there came communists in 1945. They liberated Sarajevo in April of that year. Yeah, also what I forgot to mention, in 1942, some missionaries from the head of the state of Croatia, independent state of Croatia, Ante Pavelic, so he sent some officers to try to convince Father Varnava to become bishop of the Croatian Orthodox Church. which was something similar to what we have now in Montenegro. As you know, there is also a kind of illegal church, or so-called church, which is in fact not a church. The institution of Montenegrin church, so-called, which is in fact a schismatic or just heretical institution, not based in what is needed for church to exist at all. So that's the same what was tried to be established during the independent state of Croatia. What Ante Pavelić wanted to establish there, to try to convert some of the Serb Orthodox into the Roman Catholicism, and the other part of them to convert to become Croatians, but Orthodox Croatians. So it was kind of a double policy, just to destroy the Serbian population and Serbian identity, both as Serbs and as an Orthodox. So Father Varnava reluctantly rejected that offer, and he still stayed alive after that, which is also interesting point. Although being so brave to say no to Ante Pavelić, similar like what Peter Zimonjić, his spiritual father, and Platon of Banja Luka did the same, but they were murdered. At the same time, Father Varnava survived. And okay, communists came in 1945. He still served there, and he was invited several times to the police stations to be interviewed by the police about his activities during the war, because it was really controversial, even for the communist powers, how he survived, although being a priest and monk of Serbian church. So it was also suspicious to them. But in fact, there was another reason why communists started persecution to him, and as we will see soon. So 2 years later, in 1947, in the total lack of bishops on the territory of ex-independent state of Croatia, which comprise Bosnia-Herzegovina and Croatia, there were only 1 or 2 bishops survived the war out of 10 before the war. So in order to fill the gap which rose there, Varnava was consecrated a bishop in 1947. It was a very famous and historical council of the bishops of Serbian Orthodox Church that year. At the time, about 5 or 6 new bishops were elected and consecrated. Most of them were really heroic bishops, really steadfast and firm in their faith, in expressing their faith, really outstanding personalities in our Serbian Orthodox Church. Among them, it was Bishop Varnava. So he was consecrated as an adjunct bishop, as titular bishop of Hvostna, and sent to Sarajevo to help organizing church there in the lack of the diocesan bishop. But at the very same point that when he was consecrated in a cathedral church in Belgrade, it's across the patriarchal building in the very center of Belgrade, he gave a sermon on the occasion of his consecration, where he told that he knows that at that point he is following his Lord Jesus Christ and climbing to the Golgotha hill. As you know, Golgotha is the place where our Lord Jesus Christ was crucified. And Bishop Varnava compared that in the same manner, that he feels that this government, communist government, behaves in the same manner as Jewish people behaved against our Lord Jesus Christ. So he could foresee what was going on, what would happen to him later So that's why he made the comparison that he's climbing on his Golgotha in his service over the communist regime there. And it really happened, fulfilled just a few months later. At the end of the same year, in 1947, in December, he was arrested upon the accusation of the activities against the state, which meant that he allegedly maintained connections with some Popovic forces and some Chetnik forces during the government of independent state of Croatia, that he also collaborated with Germans, Nazi Germans, and so on. In fact, it was mock trial. It lasted just 2 days, as many other mock trials in communist era. But what was behind that trial? As you know, in 1946, a very infamous Cardinal Bishop of the Roman Catholic Church in Croatia, Aloysius Stepinac, was also arrested, but righteously arrested because he supported genocide over the Serbian population in Croatia and their conversion into Roman Catholicism, the forced conversion, which is not only righteousness from the state point, but also from the church point. But anyway, he was under arrest in 1946, and a trial started in the spring of 1947, which was also covered massively by media at the time. And in order to make reciprocity and balance between Serbs and Croatians, which would be the case all over the communist era, throughout the whole communist era, they've always tried to make this reciprocity. Although more on the side of Croatians participated and joined Nazi forces and participated in mass crimes and murderings and executions and genocide, way, way, way more than it was the case with Chetniks, which also may have committed some crimes, of course, but not to that extent as it was in case in Croatia and so on. That was definitely uncomparable, but communists insisted on making this balance. So in order to keep the peace between Serbs and Croatians, that's why they were looking for some kind of, let's say, a sacrificing goat, or someone who will be in position of, in prosecution, same as it was Bishop Stepinac among Croatians. So they choose Bishop Varnava because they found his file from Second World War that could be like all his activities and everything could be fakely represented as he had some kind of interactions with some Nazi forces. Because it was really easy for somebody to pack something like that and make some kind of story about that, because it is really hard to explain for unbelieving persons how God protects his saints, those who bravely express faith and live according to the God's orders, as was the case with Bishop Varnava. So that was why communists find something suspicious there. In the case of Bishop Varnava, they used this, they just took a usage of that to make their fake stories and so on, to make this accusation. So he was sentenced to 11 years in prison in harsh conditions, very strict and harsh conditions with the forced labor including there. And what happened is that he was transferred immediately to from the prison of Sarajevo, where he stayed before the sentencing. Then after that, he was transferred to Herzegovina, to the city of Stolac, then to Mitrovica, then to Zenica, many other prisons. They also tried to break him, not only physically, but also psychologically, by moving him here and there, very harsh conditions over the winter, And they saw that he is still so firm that it won't be easy to break him. In that way, they decided to undertake some other steps. As you know, when he arrived in Sremska Mitrovica prison, which was very infamous prison even before the Second World War, for many ex-communist leaders, which became communist leaders after the Second World War, they were imprisoned during the previous regime of Kingdom of Yugoslavia. They stayed there in prison, so they wanted to retaliate to many of those from the ex-Yugoslavia administration, so they put many people there, including many lawyers, medical doctors, intellectuals, professors, based on fake accusations. They were sent to Mitrovica, and even in a way harsher conditions than it was the case during the Kingdom of Yugoslavia. There were no windows, no protection from the coldness from the outside weather conditions, so they were staying practically the same temperature as the outside. During the winter, it was like freezing cold. But Bishop Varnava and many other prisoners were, let's say, spiritually or even physically, were heating themselves by their prayers, by their even loudly singing troparions, church hymns, praying loudly, which also disturbed guards there. So they tried like making them some additional reprisals, putting them in solitary confinement, a lot of other things, as you can imagine or not even imagine how difficult it was. But nothing could break these people. First of all, Bishop Varnava as a leader, once he came there, he became immediately a spiritual leader as the highest ranking churchman there. And he acted in that way. He really felt all these prisoners as his spiritual children, as his flock. And he organized them just with almost no words. They just understood each other. They started that way of attitude, and it irritated a lot all those authorities in the prison. So they decided that they must do something else. What they did is they insinuated a traffic accident, if we can say so. At one point, Bishop Varnava was ordered to be sent from Mitrovica to another prison in Zenica in Bosnia, back to Bosnia. In the winter of 1950, like end of 1950, 3 years after his sentence serving started. And during that transportation, just nearby the city of Zenica, nearby the prison where he was transported to, the train convoy stopped, and they moved the locomotive from the head of that convoy and left one of the car on the trains on the railroad, the one which was filled by these prisoners from Sremska Mitrovica, including Bishop Varnava. And they left it on the crossroad of the trains. So, and they put it overnight. It was all designed and planned for intentional accident, which was about to happen. And next morning, early in the morning, next day, what happened is that the other train was coming in a full speed and hit exactly that car, that wagon. And many people were murdered. But Bishop Varnava survived again. His both hands and both legs were broken. It was very complicated bone breakings, you know. But they even did not allow the people who were living nearby to come and help to make a first aid to those wounded there and survived, including Bishop Varnava. But they ordered, under the treatment of strict punishments, that nobody can approach that area until secret police comes there, because they must survey that area and keep the control if nobody just escape or something like that. But in fact, the reason was they wanted even those who were wounded to die in the meantime before the first aid comes to help them. So they were left several more hours just like crying in pain without any help. But still, Bishop Varnava survived it. And what happened as a consequence, his limbs were not properly healed ever after that. So it was like, I'm not sure about the medical terminology, but the restoring of the bones were not proper. So he would not be able to normally walk and use his hands as before that accident, that injury. That's what communists even wanted for him to happen, to prevent him from further serving in future. Because they realized, they understood that he would never be able to accept the willing of just to be expelled from service as a bishop. And it was the case. So he was conditionally released upon many petitions which were written by not only authorities of church from Serbian Orthodox Church, but from the other sisterhood churches of Greece, of Bulgaria, of Romania, of the other countries, and even more from the other statesmen, even from some people from United States of America, because Bishop Varnava was a citizen of United States as well, as born in the United States. And that was eventually the reason why he had to be released upon a parole in 1952, but it was conditional release from prison. And he was ordered to be staying in a house imprisonment, or I'm not sure whether we can say that technically it was like a monastery imprisonment. He was not allowed to move from one monastery which he was assigned to. At the beginning, it was Gominica monastery near my home city of Banja Luka. And there he stayed for almost 3 years. And some nuns from that sisterhood of Gominica monastery who are still alive, they still remember Bishop Varnava. I talked to one of them, to the abbess of the monastery, maybe 7 years ago, when she testified how she remembered at that time in the mid-50s when Bishop Varnava was among them. And that's the photo to the far left, as you see. Later on, he was transferred from there because communist authorities, upon his arrival to Gominica, communist authorities ordered him to be followed by secret police for life. And it was the case exactly that he was always monitored by secret police and by some police in civil, and even by some collaborators of the police, among some villagers and peasants there around. So they realized that Bishop Varnava is always being very charismatic, and again, he was attracting many people to come even more and more to Gominica monastery and to start a new spiritual seed for possibly anti-communist activities, as they perceived it in that way. So they forbid him to stay there anymore and ordered a synod of Serbian church to assign him to another monastery. And synod assigned Bishop Varnava to monastery of Vavedenje in Belgrade, so that he can be better controlled also by communist authorities and government in Belgrade. So he stayed in Vavedenje also for about 2 years. That's the other photo here. He spent most of his time serving divine liturgies, the other services, and praying. And besides that, he started writing many explanations about what is going on and circular letters to parishioners, because he was forbidden from preaching, giving sermons. but he was writing secret documents which he was distributing among the faithful people. And it was the case that somebody also intercept one of these letters and saw that he is still active, and then he was ordered to be sent to monastery of Beočin. He was also put in forcible retirement. So he asked to be retired after his broken legs and hands, claiming that he cannot serve anymore. But after he recovered, not fully recovered, but yet enough to be able to serve, he asked the Holy Synod of Serbian Orthodox Church to be rehabilitated and reactivated. And the Holy Council of Serbian Orthodox Church was about to restore him, to give him back to the diocese, even to upgrade him from the titular bishop to the diocesan bishop. But communist authorities interceded that, and they didn't allow that. So he was moved to monastery Beočin. And in Beočin monastery, he reposed in Lord on November 12, 1964. What is important here is we must point out that it was under suspicious circumstances. Almost for sure, he was murdered by an agent of secret police who gave it's proposed that it was a toxic substance, kind of drug, which he was allergic to, and it was given to him during his visitation to dentist. He went to dentist that day. He had an appointment, but unfortunately, the technician there and the dentist was most probably connected with the communists at that point. So the symptoms which Bishop Varnava expressed on that day were very much similar to the ailment poisons like arsenic and something like that in very low amount. So he had like peripheral circulation problems and some diarrhea, and so that he passed away the very same day in the evening. The other thing that gave rise to this suspicion is that the bishop of the Srem diocese, where Beočin monastery belonged to, as you know, Beočin is a city and village. I mean, it's hard to say whether it's now city or village anymore. A small city, let's say, in the northern part of Srem, in Vojvodina. And at the time, there was a bishop Makari, or how we can pronounce it, who was found later by some historians that he maintained some contacts with UDBA. UDBA is the name of the secret police in ex-communist Yugoslavia. And he maintained some relations with them, that's almost sure. And that's why Bishop Varnava was sent there to be kept an eye of Bishop Makari. As we see, it's sad, but we must say sometimes even some clergymen were forced and were put on pressure so that they could not sustain it in a proper way, and they did some kind of collaboration. But whatever, it's not Bishop Makari who is responsible at all for the death of Bishop Varnava. It was his murder was committed in secret, and it was later on, it was found in archives of UDBA in Belgrade, the details about the plans perpetuated for the murdering of Bishop Varnava, since he was no more needed as alive, as his counteract of Bishop Stepinac, who was the reason why also Bishop Varnava was, as you know, was captured and arrested. And so Bishop Stepinac passed away a few years before that, so there was no technical reason to preserve the situation and to make troubles both to communist authorities and to church, so they decided just to murder him. But for all his life and for his firm staying and serving God and following Christ in his martyrdom, Bishop Varnava was recognized as a saint in November 2006 Council of Serbian Orthodox Church. Okay, I'll give also a brief overview about the other saint who had even more brutal end. That's Saint Jakov of Tumane, who was born in 1894 as Radoje Arsovic. His family origins are from Montenegro or Herzegovina, definitely southern part of Serbian principalities. Even from his childhood, he was really extremely talented personality, outstanding in school, great in many aspects. So he graduated with a double PhD, PhD in philosophy and JD in law, both in France, one in the so famous Sorbonne University in Paris, the other in the Montpellier University. Then he served in diplomacy as a clerk, then later he climbed up in the rankings. So eventually he became a chief, head of the embassy office as ambassador in Paris in France, starting in 1929. But he was very active as a supporter of Bogomolci movement. I mentioned about that movement in the lecture of Saint Bishop Nikolai. It was a movement of common people, laymen, most of them like peasants, or some people from cities like citizens, who were devoted to church services, who were reading Gospels and New Testament, Old Testament, and also were spreading this attitude of being a part of church, going to services and preaching the faith among the other in their communities. So that movement was supported by Bishop Nikolai, who was appointed the head of that movement by the Holy Synod of Serbian Church. And Radoje Arsovic at the time, he was a very active supporter and member of that movement. So he wrote many articles, also discussing many problems among common people. He was also warning about the the declining of the moral, declining of the spirituality among Serbian people between the two world wars, which was also very indicative that there is kind of degradation, moral degradation. And he warned us even as a layman. Then he decided to become a monk. Once he decided to become a monk, he went to Bishop Nikolai, whom he knew from Bogomolci movement. And at the time, Bishop Nikolai transferred from Ohrid to Žiča monastery. So Radoje went to Žiča, and in 2 years he became monk. At that time, he completely started his monastic life as a very strict ascetic approach. He was eating very few, rarely. He's spending all his life in silent praying, not speaking much, not meeting people much, and also, which is characteristic to him, he was feeling himself unworthy of receiving priesthood or becoming a priest. So he was really like humble monk, very similar to the ascetic monks from Mount Athos. And he really put all these monastic ways of living just based from what he, as a very educated person, knew from the deeds, work of holy fathers, from the descriptions of their lives, and so he was following in a literal and very strict manner. He was very strict, most to himself first, and then not to other people, as you know, it's very characteristic to real monks. So, as we see, the point is that a person of his capabilities, who had such a brilliant education, brilliant talents, and also very outstanding position in the society, decided to abandon everything and to become a humble monk with nothing in possession, which is a really deep contrast. And for such a great readiness, his readiness to leave everything, to abandon everything for the love of God, God gave him such a bless that he even was able to foresee some events, some details that were about to happen. And at the same time, he was behaving sometimes as a fool for Christ, or how we can say this. He was behaving as having a madness or something like that, in order to hide the talents given by God to him and his ability to foresee some events. He behaved as a fool, as a madman, to avoid reprisals from people. Okay. And during the war, the Second World War, he left Žiča monastery and went into the people, into the he was visiting many churches, giving sermons and prayings there, and also warning people about what is going on there, also giving them small books of prayers. And he never stopped doing that all over the war. And at the end of the war, so communists started torturing him a lot because he moved to Belgrade and started preaching in the church in Belgrade, although being only a monk, not a priest. But many priests in Belgrade and all over the Serbia knew about him and his great education at one side, and at the same time being so humble monk. So he acted as Old Testament prophets, very similar manner. His so-called madness was in fact as a paradigm for being able to say what he plans in a hidden form, and also to save the people whom he was preaching to, so that they will be saved from the communists. And eventually, on one occasion, while he was walking back from one church to the monastery where he was residing at the time, it was near Požarevac in eastern Serbia. Communists intercepted him on his way back. It was like early night hours, early evening hours. So he was beaten to death. He was beaten so brutally that in 6 days from then, he passed away. And his last willing was to be buried in a monastery of Tumane, which was nearby city of Požarevac. He didn't want to be put in the monastery of his monastic vows and his life previously in the monastery of Žiča, but he wanted to be buried anywhere, to the closest monastery where he was about to die, which is also a very old monastic manner to be buried anywhere, not to be apprised, and so he was canonized as a saint in 2010, once when his relics were opened and found incorruptible. And okay, so as a conclusion, I can say that both of these saints acted in a manner that sometimes we should ask ourselves how far we are from them and how far we can get closer to them in a way not to be afraid to confess our faith, even when there are very stormy attitude around us, when it's not very well received. And at the same time, that we must follow Christ's words and Christ's life in our lives. That's how we are asked to live. That's why we are created for. And that's what these holy fathers, holy men, accepted and have lived their life in that manner. What I wanted just at the end to point out is, I mentioned at the beginning, there is some difference between why I didn't put these two saints in the story about martyrs for faith, because at that time, in that case, there were some kind of occupant forces who were responsible for murdering those saints like Saint Platon and Saint Peter of Sarajevo. It was like Ustasha movement, which was like puppet state of the Nazi Germans and so on. But in this case, it was happening by the government of recognized state, recognized country of communist Yugoslavia, which was recognized by almost all the countries in the world. And at the same time, very well received by many states, not only from the Eastern Bloc, but also from the Western Bloc during the Cold War. So in such state, that the government were persecuting and murdering some of the clergymen. That's very characteristic. So those people, like these two saints, were not murdered in a time of chaos, in time of losing of like state of war or something like that, when there's like losing the order of the government and the rulership or something like that. But in time when there was peace and the regular state of the functioning of one government and so on, but still the communist regime was extremely crimeful, if I can say like that, or like making these persecutions all of the first half of their era, of their epoch, all throughout 40s, 50s, and 60s. Later on, they started a bit changing in the policy as the communist states started to decline. So then it was a bit changed. So since it's more than an hour of my talk, sorry about this exceeding the time. Thank you for your attention, and please let's start the discussion or your question or whatever. One more time, thank you. I saw that there was some there were some questions here in chat or something. Okay. There is a question, if I can say, well, have certain things in common. Okay. Okay, so anybody to ask a question or to comment something? Oh, well, okay. Not sure if I can unmute you or you can unmute yourself, whatever. I can try to unmute you if you want.
There. Am I mute?
Oh, so you can unmute yourself. I guess it's possible, of course. So, yeah, Yasmina, yeah.
Yeah.
Go
So
on.
it was news to me that the communists were so cruel, and they actually tortured and killed
Oh, yeah, they were
monks
from
and women.
1945 until 1965, let's say arbitrarily 2 decades. First 2 decades, they were very brutal.
But it's easy to believe in the light of what's happening today with our riots and everything. So I'm sure.
Well, I wouldn't say this so because, well, you mean riots in Serbia, in Yugoslavia, or where? What do you mean?
Oh, no. Here, what we have all over the world because of George Floyd, right?
Oh, about this. Yeah, this is quite different. Yeah,
But
this police
it's
brutality, well, it's a general problem everywhere. It can be kind of this, but this is not just police brutality. It's quite absolutely different.
it's not accepting somebody who has a different opinion than you, somebody who's different. So they're practicing their own religion and they were not accepted for that.
Well,
So
yeah, but you can try to say it here that it's the same, like somebody does not accept this guy who was murdered. That's different, absolutely different from this. This was like kind of a general state of
state of affairs.
church was forbidden. In fact, kind of. Although technically it was said that it's not forbidden, but it was persecuted to the extent that they tried just to close the church in total. They had intention in the first several years of communist government. So it's way more mass phenomena than this here. This is just kind of random. Okay, somebody is murdered by the police brutality here or there by some kind of either mad policeman or by other whatever, some kind of racism locally or whatever. But this was quite different in the communist state of Yugoslavia at the beginning.
No, what I was just saying, it's easy to believe seeing what's happening today. So I had no idea that was happening back in communism. I didn't know that was to that degree.
Yeah, okay, well,
You know,
you can see whatever, but I cannot find any connections, any like comparative things between these two.
I'm not
Anyway,
comparing. I'm just saying that it's what
okay, yeah,
easy
to
to
some
believe. Yeah.
extension you can see something like that, maybe. Yeah, okay. Anyway, thank
That's,
you.
mhm.
I don't see how many people are attending this lecture. Just 6. Oh, well. Anyway, we are losing participants.
Hey, Miroslav, it's Zlata again.
Hey, Zlato. Welcome to our lectures. Nice to
Yeah,
have you here.
nice to see you. Nice to hear what you're saying. I really appreciate what you're doing. It's amazing.
Thank you.
I'm old enough that I remember some of those stuff. So you're absolutely right, and everything you said, what I know is right, is correct. So,
Oh, okay. Thank you.
great.
You mean about this communist
Yeah,
behavior and so?
exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. I know a lot of like examples, but it's not a place to share that.
Absolutely, yeah. It was
Yeah.
many cases,
Oh, yeah.
especially in Montenegro, in Bosnia and Herzegovina, like in 45, 46, 47, in these years.
Mhm.
Also, like my parents know some cases like that. There was
Yeah.
a very famous priest in one of the villages around Banja Luka who was murdered by his coachman. He was like coached by some, I mean, not coach, how they say this, like it was in the past when there were no cars and and they used some kind of like how to say it's like horse and it's kind of wheel.
Yeah, Kochia.
Would you say kochia, whatever, yeah, and he's what we say kochiash, I'm not sure how we say in English.
Yeah.
Yeah, that guy was in fact bribed by communists and he murdered that priest.
Yeah.
and many other examples, but especially in 40s, from 45 until 49, it was most cruel period. Then later they put them in jails, like throughout 50s, and in 60s they started a little bit change once they were establishing their state more firmly. Then they didn't have any need for persecuting priests and church anymore. I think they just put it aside.
Yeah,
it's a political question more than religious question, but anyway, thank you for this.
Yeah, and I think we need more of you, because what I mean, we need more people like you.
Well, yeah, I plan not to be only me myself as a lecturer here. I just want to animate other friends and acquaintances of mine to give lectures on various topics. Now I just wanted to complete this series of lectures about saints in modern times. And now that we are about to end this, I plan now to start other topics so that we can now include many other lecturers and speakers.
Yeah, it's nice. It's nice to hear actual istina.
The truth, yes, all the truth about what is going on here. Yeah, exactly.
About Serbs, yes. It's really important to share the truth about Serbs. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. That's right. Yeah. And always I want to make some points which have some connection, like from the time of those saints to our time nowadays. So what we can take as good examples for our lives. And in case of all which we have heard tonight is that when these holy fathers could be living in the manner they lived, and that's so harsh time, what can we say now when we have way more liberty and freedom to live, and we are still sometimes afraid to say something or to do something just for some conformism, for no even punishment for something, but just we don't want to be a bit strange or to be misunderstood or something like that. We are making some kind of calculations, and I mean, that's something that we should be warned off by the examples of these holy fathers.
I agree.
They were ready to give their lives in such horrible times, and we are not even ready to say something and to be mocked, for instance, say, oh, you're saying some old-time religion that is nonsense. Whatever people would say about us, we should be firm and stay in this who we are.
Yes, and we will be.
And we will be. Yeah. We will be more appreciated, like this example of Bishop Varnava, who was it was so controversial that he stayed alive. Some people really can be suspicious, maybe he really collaborated with somebody. And definitely many historians tried to find something, but there was no evidence of anything. He really was just serving, which is really possible. And we can just be seeing many examples from New Testament, like Apostle Paul, who also was expressing his faith. You can read it even in his epistles, in his also works of apostles, in many books of New Testament, where it's about Apostle Paul. You can see him preaching, giving such deep sermons to Roman officials and staying alive.
Yeah.
Unlike the other people who were like afraid from something, fearful, like cowards, and they were murdered. That's also another example from Russia, from 1930s. There's also one bishop who was in fact a medical doctor. And in the time of great communist revolution in Russia, in Soviet Union then, many clergymen left their faith, left their church for the fear. But some people like him, who was like medical doctor, he expressed faith in that time, not even before. He was, let's say, faithful person coming to church and so on, but not so deeply. But after 1917, he started giving sermons as a layman. Then some clergymen who still stayed in church, they noticed him as such, and they recommended, why this doctor shouldn't become priest and then give regular sermons, not as a layman and so. And then they ordained him a priest. Then soon afterwards, he became bishop. And then as a bishop, he immediately was imprisoned and then persecuted for a long, long time. And what I remember in that story, in 1937, during the great purges in Soviet Union by Stalin, that bishop, metropolitan at the time, he was put on trial, and also they tried to get some testimonies, fake testimonies from some people. They put them on pressure, like torturized some clergymen to fakely accuse this bishop. And some of them fakely accused him, saying liars. And so they were lying to save their lives. And he did not want to say anything. He just said the truth, that he doesn't want to accept any guiltiness because he was not guilty for anything. And he didn't want to sign confirmation of his guilts, you know. And all the other people who signed that they're guilty, those all were murdered, executed. But he who did not sign, although being horribly tortured, like they didn't allow him to sleep for 6 days. I cannot even imagine how somebody can stay in that way, in that manner. If there is any medical expert among us, they can say that when you do not sleep for so long, you become so extensively, how to say, prone to manipulation. You can accept everything that somebody tell you to do, whatever. It's just so suggestible. We can say suggestible. But he still survived somehow. Even he did not want to accept, even being so tired, so sleepy, he didn't want to sign it. And all those people, among them, it was a priest who baptized him, the other one who ordained him. They also accused him fakely, and those were murdered, and he was not.
Yeah.
So amazing story. And after the war, during the war, he was imprisoned. He asked Stalin, can I please be released to be sent to the front to save wounded soldiers, as he was a surgeon. And he was allowed to go there, and he was there. He was saving lives of soldiers. After the war in 1946, he was awarded a Lenin Prize, the highest ranking honor in Soviet Union, which is amazing. And when he was asked to come to receive that award, he told, I can come only wearing the priest robes and panagia, which is symbol of bishops, you know. Which means I can come only as a bishop, not as in a civil dressing. Some people protest over that, some communist authorities protested, but eventually Stalin himself allowed that.
Nice story.
It was sad for Stalin that he really deeply appreciated those brave people.
Yeah.
Whatever they believe in. But if they are brave and firmly stay in something, Stalin appreciated that a lot. It was same with Mikhail Sholokhov, who wrote Tikhy Don, famous novel. And so it was the case with him. At some point, he was sharply criticized by somebody, I don't know, by some communist authority. And he came to give a replica response to that. And he told that it was a president who criticized him, president of Literary Society. He told, okay, do you want me to respond to you as a president or to respond to you as a man? And the guy told me, oh, respond to me as a man. Then Sholokhov came down from the stage, approached him, and put him, like, slapped him.
Wow.
And immediately some spies called Stalin and told, oh, Sholokhov slapped the president of Literary Society. And Stalin told, oh, he did good. It's very, very funny, but realistic story about about this.
Nice.
Okay, so I think I took so much of your time. Maybe it's time to end up this lecture. And
Thank you, Miroslav.
Anyway, thank you, Zlata. Thank you so much. Thank you, everybody, for your attention.
You.
Have a good night. Bye.
You too. Bye, guys.
Thank you.